the first sound isn't a voice. It's gunfire. Not distant. Not echoing. Close, violent, wrong. A convoy of trucks rolls through the darkness like it owns the road. Headlights dimmed. Engines low. Men riding in the back with rifles pointed down, calm in the way only experienced criminals can be calm. They've done this before. They've taken land before. They've taken lives before. This is supposed to be easy. A ranch sits ahead, quiet, heavy with sleep. Fences. Open land. A house set back from the road. The kind of property that looks like a lifetime of work, not the kind of place that belongs in cartel territory. But cartels don't ask what a place means. They ask what it can be used for. A corridor. A hideout. A message. A trophy. The trucks stop in a practiced formation. Doors swing open. Boots hit dirt. The men spread out in a half circle and lift their weapons like they're performing a ritual. This isn't just intimidation, it's conditioning. A reminder of how things work here. One of them shouts toward the house. Another fires into the air. The gunshot cracks through the night and hangs there, waiting for a response. That's how it usually begins, loud enough to wake the whole ranch, loud enough to make everyone inside understand they have seconds to decide whether they want to live. Because the script is simple. You open the door. You step outside. You surrender the keys, the land, the pride, whatever they demand. And if you do it fast enough, sometimes they let you keep your breath. But tonight, the door doesn't open. No lights flicker on. No footsteps. No shadows behind the curtains. Just silence. It's the kind of silence that makes even violent men feel a flicker of irritation, and then suspicion. Because nobody stays silent when a cartel is outside. Not unless something is wrong. One man steps forward, annoyed now, raising his rifle toward a window. He expects movement. A silhouette. Fear. Instead. A flash. A crack. The man jerks backward like he's been yanked by an invisible rope. His rifle slips from his hands. He collapses into the dirt without a word. For a second, the others don't even process what they just saw. Because it doesn't fit reality. Then the second shot hits. Glass explodes. A third shot follows. Then the night becomes chaos. Cartel gunmen scramble for cover, diving behind trucks, behind tires, behind the bodies of their friends. Someone screams orders. Someone screams a name. Someone screams because a bullet just tore through flesh and the pain is too sudden to contain. They fire back immediately, turning the ranch house into splinters and dust. Bullets punch holes through walls. The sound is deafening. It feels like the air itself is being shredded. And still, the return fire from inside doesn't stop. It moves. One window. Then another. Then a different angle entirely. It sounds like multiple defenders inside the house. Like a team. Like an ambush. But the cartel knows this ranch. They know who lives here. A 77-year-old man. A ranch owner. No criminal history. No militia. No cartel ties. Just an old man. So how is he firing like that? How is he aiming like that? How is he not panicking? A grenade is thrown. It arcs through the darkness and disappears into the house. The explosion shakes the land. Dust rises. Smoke pours out. The cartel men expect screaming. They expect a door bursting open. They expect terror. Instead, the gunfire answers again. Sharp. Controlled. Like the person inside isn't trapped. Like the person inside is waiting. It's not just defiance. It's something worse for the cartel mindset. It's refusal. The firefight stretches out longer than it ever should. Minutes pass. Then more minutes. Then the first hour bleeds into the second. Every time the cartel tries to push closer, bullets force them back. Every time they believe the shooter must be reloading or tired or dead, another shot lands. Another man drops. Another body becomes proof that this ranch is not surrendering tonight. The cartel men begin to argue. You can hear it in their shouting, the shift from confidence to frustration to fear. Because a simple takeover has turned into a humiliation. And humiliation is deadly in cartel culture. Humiliation spreads. It inspires. If this becomes a story, the wrong people will hear it, people who've been quiet, people who've been taking the abuse, people who've been waiting for a reason to believe resistance is possible. Daylight begins to creep into the horizon. That changes everything. Cartels love darkness. Darkness hides what they do. Darkness makes witnesses unreliable. Darkness makes victims feel alone. But daylight makes people brave enough to look out windows. Daylight makes authorities respond faster, even when they don't want to. Daylight creates consequences. The cartel gunmen realize they've stayed too long. They were supposed to arrive, terrify, claim, and vanish. Instead, they've been pinned down by one house and one unseen defender for hours. A few men shout for a final push. Others don't move. Not because they're cowards. Because they've started counting. They've started noticing who isn't answering. They've started seeing blood on the dirt where there shouldn't be blood. And then something happens that the cartel does not forgive easily. They retreat. Trucks start backing up, pulling away from the ranch. Engines roar as the convoy rearranges itself, not into an attack line, but into a getaway. They fire into the house again, not to win, only to cover their escape. And then they're gone. They disappear into the morning like a nightmare that refuses to explain itself. When the Marines arrive later, the ranch looks like a battlefield. The air smells like burned powder and torn wood. The ground is littered with shell casings, an impossible number of them. Evidence of a fight so intense it doesn't make sense coming from one house. Outside, cartel bodies lie where they fell. Some dead. Some barely alive. And that alone is shocking, because cartels don't leave their men behind unless something went very wrong. But what the Marines find inside the house is worse. Because the defender wasn't a squad. It wasn't a militia. It wasn't the police. It was the ranch owner himself. A 77-year-old man. Dead inside his own home, surrounded by weapons he cleaned and prepared like tools for a final job. He didn't die begging. He didn't die running. He died fighting. And in cartel logic, that's dangerous. Because cartels survive by convincing the world resistance is pointless. Their power isn't only guns, it's psychological certainty. They want everyone to believe that the moment a cartel comes for you, the story is already finished. But this old man refused that ending. He turned his home into a statement. A statement written in gunfire and stubbornness. And now, the cartel has a new problem. They didn't just fail to take a ranch. They created a legend. And legends do what bullets can't stop. They travel. They spread. They become something people whisper when they're tired of obeying. And somewhere in another town, another person hears the story and thinks something they've never allowed themselves to think before. Maybe cartels aren't invincible. Maybe fear isn't permanent. maybe the script can be broken. But then comes the darker part, the part cartels understand even better than hope. A cartel never forgets humiliation. It keeps score. It studies what went wrong. And it doesn't just punish the person who embarrassed them. It punishes the idea. So the question becomes unavoidable. If one old ranch owner could force cartel gunmen to retreat, how many other people have been waiting for their moment to fight back? And what happens when the cartel decides to make an example so brutal, no one ever tries again? Because this wasn't the end of the story. This was the warning shot. And the next time the cartel comes, it won't come to intimidate. It will come to erase. The cartel convoy retreated at sunrise, leaving bodies behind like they were broken tools. And that alone was unheard of. But what was worse, what the cartel could not tolerate, was the meaning behind that retreat. Because cartels don't just dominate territory with bullets. They dominate with belief. The belief that resistance is pointless. The belief that even bravery is just a slower way to die. The belief that the moment a cartel takes interest in you, your life is already over. But that ranch, those shell casings, the scorched walls, the bodies in the dirt, told a different story. It told people something dangerous. A cartel can bleed. And once people learn that, fear begins to change shape. That's how cartels get reckless. They don't always move because it's profitable. Sometimes they move because they need to restore the illusion. And restoring the illusion means finding the person who embarrassed them and making sure the punishment is unforgettable. But here's the problem. Sometimes the wrong person is already dead. Sometimes the person they needed to crush has already become a legend. So the cartel looks for the next best target. The idea. The next person who might get inspired. The next person who might resist. That's why these stories follow a pattern. Not just violence, but correction. A cartel makes a move. Someone refuses to behave like a victim. And suddenly, the cartel's attention becomes personal. Not business. Personal. Because when power is challenged, it becomes emotional. And emotional cartels don't just kill. They punish. They humiliate. They destroy entire families to prove a point. And that's where the stories begin to connect. Because Don Alejo wasn't the first wrong person. He wasn't even the rarest. He was simply the loudest example of a truth cartels hate. There are people they cannot control with fear. And that truth repeats across Mexico in different forms. A lime farmer who refused extortion and built an armed resistance. A mother who turned her grief into a hunt so precise it embarrassed organized crime. A U.S. agent whose effectiveness forced a cartel to commit the single most catastrophic mistake in its history. And a cartel lieutenant who learned too late that blood ties don't protect you when money is at stake. These aren't just individual stories. They're warnings. And the warning is simple. The cartel doesn't always lose because it's weaker. It loses when it makes the wrong enemy. Because the wrong enemy doesn't quit. The wrong enemy doesn't negotiate. The wrong enemy turns survival into purpose. And the most terrifying part? Cartels often create these enemies themselves, by pushing too far. So the question becomes unavoidable. What happens when cartel power meets a person who has nothing left to lose, except the right to fight back? Because when that happens, the cartel is no longer dealing with a victim. It's dealing with a force. And forces don't beg. They collide. In places where cartels rule, people don't wake up thinking about politics. They wake up thinking about survival. A farmer thinks about crops, debts, children. A shop owner thinks about inventory, rent, family dinners. And in cartel territory, every normal thought has a shadow attached to it. Who controls this area? Who will ask for money? Who will punish me if I say no? That's how it began in Michoacan. The Knights Templar didn't just traffic drugs. They taxed daily life. They controlled businesses like landlords of fear. Even industries as ordinary as limes became cartel property in practice, because extortion made legal ownership meaningless. Families worked land for generations, and then one day, armed men decided the land belonged to them. Not on paper. In reality. And reality is the only currency that matters when someone is pointing a rifle at your face. Hipólito Mora was a farmer. He wasn't looking to become an icon. But iconhood isn't chosen in cartel territory. It's assigned. Because the cartel crossed a line that wasn't about money. It was about humiliation. They told Mora his son couldn't harvest limes on their own farm. That moment matters because it wasn't extortion anymore. It was domination of identity. It was a cartel saying, "Your family belongs to us." And Mora reacted in the one way cartels cannot tolerate. He said no. He organized. He armed people who had never carried weapons. He built alliances with men who were once afraid to even whisper. He helped form the autodefenses, self-defense groups that surged in towns where the government felt distant and the cartel felt permanent. At first, it looked like a miracle. Ordinary citizens pushed back. Cartel roadblocks fell. Cartel control weakened. For the first time in years, people felt the air change. But that kind of power comes with a hidden cost. Once you build an armed movement, you have to control what it becomes. And that's the risk. A resistance group can defeat a cartel, and then transform into one. Because power always attracts opportunists. Men who don't care about justice, they care about control. And inside the autodefenses, fractures began. Rival leaders emerged. Trust splintered. Ego replaced unity. And while Mora still thought he was fighting the cartel, the movement around him began shifting into something darker. He was building a weapon. But he couldn't guarantee who would eventually wield it. As the Knights Templar weakened, everyone wanted to claim the victory. Politicians. Military commanders. Rival armed factions. And in cartel territory, victory is dangerous because it creates vacuum. A vacuum pulls in predators. Mora's influence grew. He became the face of defiance. He spoke publicly. He revealed information about criminal operations. He pushed the narrative that ordinary people could fight back. That made him powerful. And it made him doomed. Because cartels will forgive many things. They will not forgive embarrassment. Worse, the collapse of one cartel didn't end crime. It reshuffled it. Los Viagras emerged, one of the groups formed out of the chaos, connected to former self-defense fighters and former cartel-linked figures. In other words, the revolution was being hijacked. And the community started seeing something horrifying. Some of the men who once claimed to protect them were now becoming the exact kind of force they hated. Inside the resistance movement, violence erupted, not against cartels, but between factions. And then came the moment that turned Mora from leader into haunted man. Gunfire between rival groups. Bodies. 11 deaths. And one of those deaths was Mora's son. That kind of loss doesn't simply break a person. It rewires them. After that, Mora wasn't just fighting for territory. He was fighting because surrender would mean admitting his son died for nothing. That's the point where resistance becomes personal, and personal fights never end cleanly. But the cartel world watched this carefully. They watched the fractures. They watched alliances rot. They watched leaders become isolated. And they knew Mora had become vulnerable. Because in cartel warfare, you don't always kill the strongest enemy. You wait until he's alone. Power doesn't collapse loudly in cartel territory. It collapses quietly, through missing patrols, through delayed responses, through sudden gaps in protection that no one can explain without looking afraid to say the truth. And by the time you realize you're standing alone, the decision has already been made somewhere else. Hipólito Mora had spent years living in a war that was never officially declared. To the outside world, it looked like a story of courage, a farmer leading a resistance, citizens rising up, cartel control being pushed back. But inside the state of Michoacán, it didn't feel heroic. It felt like walking across a room full of broken glass with your eyes closed, knowing that sooner or later you will bleed. Because every time Mora spoke publicly, every time he named the threat, every time he exposed a cartel presence, he wasn't just challenging criminals. He was challenging an ecosystem, an entire machinery built from fear, money, and compromise. That machinery had many moving parts. Some wore masks. Some wore uniforms. Some wore suits. And Mora understood something that most viewers don't fully grasp until it's too late. A cartel doesn't only survive on violence. It survives on permission. Not written permission. Not official permission. The permission of people who look away. The permission of officials who delay. The permission of institutions that fail at the exact moment they are needed most. That's why Mora's real danger wasn't just the cartel gunmen who wanted him dead. His real danger was the invisible layer around them, the quiet arrangement of protection and silence that makes cartel killings seem inevitable. And Mora had been poking holes in that arrangement. He had used information like a weapon, revealing details about drug laboratories and operations to authorities. That might sound like civic responsibility. In cartel logic, it's betrayal. And betrayal is the one crime they punish without mercy. In the months and years after the self-defense movement fractured, Mora saw the region mutate. The Knights Templar weakened, but crime didn't disappear. It rebranded, reorganized, adapted. New factions rose from the ashes. Former allies became predators. Former protectors became extortionists wearing a different name. This wasn't just cartels versus civilians anymore. This was civilians learning the cartel way, and deciding it worked. Los Viagras emerged as one of those forces, linked to former self-defense figures, to power-shifting hands, to a landscape where violence became the language of administration. And Mora despised them. Not only because of what they did, but because of what they represented. They were proof that fighting the cartel wasn't enough. You also had to fight the hunger for control that cartels infect into communities. But Mora stayed loud. He stayed defiant. He stayed impossible to buy. And when a cartel can't buy you, the only two options left are fear, or removal. Mora understood he was on borrowed time. He said it openly. He warned the public. He told journalists he believed he would be assassinated. He spoke about threats he received. He didn't whisper it. He didn't frame it as paranoia. He framed it as inevitability. And the more he said it, the more dangerous it became, not for him, but for the people who watched. Because if Mora could die, then anyone could. If Mora could be removed, then resistance was just a temporary illusion. That's why cartels love to kill symbols. Symbols are contagious. And eliminating symbols is psychological warfare. What makes this part of the story feel especially grim is how pressure builds in stages. It doesn't begin with bullets. It begins with behavior. You notice people stopping calls. You notice allies becoming careful. You notice police protection feeling like a performance instead of a promise. You notice unfamiliar cars slowing down near your home. You notice the air changing. The world becomes quieter, but not peaceful. Quieter like a room where everyone knows something horrible is coming, but no one wants to be the person to say it aloud. Mora's sister, Guadalupe, later made a claim that sharpened this tension into something almost unbearable. She suggested there was no meaningful presence of the National Guard, the Civil Guard, or the army during the attack on Mora. Not nearby. Not ready. Not responding like they should. In cartel territories, absence can speak louder than gunfire. Because it raises a question that is far more frightening than any cartel threat. Was the state unwilling to protect him, or instructed not to? And that question is the kind that keeps citizens silent for decades. There were other details that fed the sense of an invisible machine working against him. At one point, a key Los Viagras figure's right-hand man was arrested, but later released after the cartel stopped the convoy on the highway. That wasn't just a rescue. It was a demonstration. It was the cartel proving, in full daylight, that it could override law enforcement logistics like flipping a switch. It was the cartel showing everyone watching that the system wasn't broken. It was owned. And Mora was still alive inside that reality. He returned home. He remained in his town. He continued being Mora. That is what makes his story psychologically haunting. He wasn't reckless in the stupid sense. He wasn't ignorant. He wasn't naive. He was simply unwilling to accept that surviving meant surrendering the place he belonged to. To leave would mean exile. To stay meant death. And he chose to stay. Because for Mora, staying wasn't a strategy. It was identity. But identities can become traps, especially when the enemy has patience. Eventually, the pressure reached its final form. The ambush wasn't random. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't an act of spontaneous rage. It was an ending that had been planned. On June 29, 2023, Mora was attacked while traveling in an armored truck. Even the detail of armored matters here. It tells you that Mora knew he was being hunted. It tells you he had already entered the stage of life where you treat every trip like a gamble. And still, the bullets found him. The vehicle was later set on fire. And that is more than a murder method. Fire erases. Fire humiliates. Fire tells the public, not only can we kill you, we can destroy what remains of you. After Mora was killed, the story didn't feel like closure. It felt like a warning delivered to the entire region. Because if a man like Mora could be hunted down and erased, then everyone else becomes smaller, quieter, easier to control. And yet, something else happened. Instead of shutting the story down, the cartel made it bigger. Because Mora's death didn't just remove a voice. It forced people to ask, why did he become a target that required this much violence? And that question creates the exact thing cartels fear. Curiosity. Curiosity becomes conversation. Conversation becomes shared anger. And shared anger becomes resistance. So now the cartel had a new problem. Not Mora, but the aftershock. Because the moment you kill a symbol publicly, you risk creating a new generation of people who no longer believe silence will protect them. And somewhere in that same territory, another person was already learning the same lesson in a different way, through loss, through rage, through a refusal to let the world keep moving. A mother. A stolen daughter. A name she would never stop hunting. And unlike Mora, she wasn't organizing crowds. She was doing something far more dangerous. She was working alone. Cartel violence doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply removes someone from your life so completely that the world feels illegally quiet afterward. No gunshots. No bodies in the street. Just absence. And in cartel territory, absence is its own kind of terror, because it forces the victim's family into a psychological prison where imagination does the torture. That's what happened to Miriam Rodriguez. Her story didn't begin with politics. It didn't begin with cartels. It began with a daughter driving through San Fernando in January 2014. Her daughter's name was Karen Alejandra Salinas Rodriguez. Karen was young. She had a life. A family. The kind of ordinary future that looks safe until something steals it in broad daylight. Trucks pulled up beside her. Armed men entered her vehicle. And Karen was taken. That moment, the simplicity of it, is what makes cartel kidnappings so psychologically dominating. They don't need complexity. They don't need stealth. They operate with the confidence of people who believe they will face no consequences. Because in many regions, they're right. The calls came. Demands. Instructions. The cruel rhythm cartels use to control families: give money, stay quiet, follow directions, and maybe your loved one returns. Miriam and her family did what victims are trained to do. They complied. Karen's father delivered money. He was told to wait at a cemetery for her release. A cemetery. Even that detail feels like foreshadowing so dark it could pass for fiction, except it wasn't fiction. Karen didn't return. After that, Miriam did something that separates her from most people: she stopped believing the cartel's narrative. Not just the obvious narrative of pay and we release her, but the deeper narrative that cartels depend on. You are powerless. Miriam refused that. She asked to meet cartel members. One agreed. He claimed he didn't know Karen's location, but offered to help for money. Miriam paid. Nothing happened. But Miriam gained something else, something the cartel didn't realize they were giving her. A name. Sama. Cartels don't understand how dangerous names can be in the hands of the right person. They assume civilians can't do anything with information. They assume even if a mother has a name, she has no pathway to justice. But Miriam wasn't thinking like a civilian anymore. She was thinking like an investigator. Weeks later, she told her other daughter the truth: Karen wasn't coming back alive. That statement sounds like surrender, but it wasn't. It was the moment Miriam's grief transformed into weaponized purpose. She said something that still chills people who study cartel violence. She didn't care if they killed her. She died the day they killed her daughter. When a person reaches that point, cartel threats stop working. Because cartels rule through leverage, fear, family, future. And Miriam had already lost the only future that mattered to her. So she started hunting. Not with rage alone, rage burns out. She hunted with discipline. She built files. She tracked addresses. She watched patterns. She observed relationships. She used social media like a map. She collected names like ammunition. Then she changed her appearance. Cut her hair. Dyed it red. The transformation wasn't vanity. It was strategy. It was camouflage. She took an old government uniform from her past work at the health ministry and used it as a disguise. She pretended to conduct surveys, asking questions that sounded harmless to strangers, but were designed to locate cartel-linked suspects. That's the detail that makes her story so unsettling. She didn't just want justice. She learned how to extract it. And she did it in a place where justice is usually sold like contraband. Eventually, she pressured enough authorities to take action. Sama was arrested. Under pressure, he began giving names, other cartel members involved. One suspect agreed to guide police to a ranch where Karen had been killed. When Miriam went there, she found physical evidence, her daughter's scarf, a cushion from her truck, even part of a femur. That moment isn't just grief. It's confirmation. Confirmation does something cruel to the human mind. It ends hope, but it also ends uncertainty. And uncertainty is the thing that keeps many families frozen. Miriam wasn't frozen anymore. After that ranch, she didn't retreat into mourning. She escalated. She tracked down more suspects. She used disguises, surveillance, psychological pressure. She helped bring 10 cartel members to justice. 10. In cartel territory, even one conviction is rare. 10 is humiliation. And humiliation is fatal. But Miriam's life didn't become easier as she succeeded. It became more dangerous. Because the cartel began to understand what she truly was. Not a grieving mother. A threat. A force that didn't need a gun to destroy them. Because she attacked the thing cartels depend on most. Their belief in impunity. And once cartel members realize a civilian is capable of hunting them down, their paranoia changes shape. It becomes violent urgency. Not because they fear prison. But because they fear loss of control. So Miriam began receiving threats. She requested protection. Police presence. Patrols. In many parts of Mexico, protection is a delicate word. It can mean security, or it can mean surveillance. It can mean help, or it can mean the state keeping track of you so the cartel can plan better. But Miriam continued anyway. And that is the fracture. Not only in Miriam's life, but in cartel psychology. Because cartels survive by categorizing people. Victims behave one way. Officials behave another. Rivals behave another. Miriam didn't fit any category. She was a civilian acting like law enforcement. A mother acting like a hunter. A woman acting like an entire institution. And the cartel could not allow that to be possible. Because if Miriam could do it, then what stops other families from doing it too? What stops communities from turning into organized retaliation? What stops the cartel from losing the one advantage it always had, people being too afraid to fight back? By 2017, that fear was becoming cartel fear. And then the cartel got a gift. A prison break. Dozens escaped. And among the escapees were kidnappers connected to Karen's case. That meant Miriam had succeeded enough to force criminals into prisons. But not enough to keep them there. Now those men were free again. Free with revenge on their mind. Free with knowledge of her name. Free with a reason to correct the humiliation she caused. And Miriam understood what that meant. It meant the clock was no longer ticking quietly. It was ticking loudly. And it was ticking for her. When you hunt cartel members long enough, you stop living inside normal time. You stop measuring days by meals or work or weekends. You measure time by threats. By sightings. By the tiny signals that tell you whether you're still safe, or whether the cartel has finally decided you've become too expensive to tolerate. For Miriam Rodriguez, the danger didn't begin the day her daughter was kidnapped. The danger began the day she succeeded. Because cartels can accept grief. They can accept mourning. They can accept victims collapsing into silence. What they cannot accept is a victim who becomes effective. A victim who learns the cartel's own methods, surveillance, intelligence, disguise, patience, and uses them against the people who were supposed to be untouchable. Miriam wasn't just taking criminals off the streets. She was damaging the cartel's mythology. And mythology is everything. Cartels don't need every citizen to fear them. They only need the majority to believe resisting them is pointless. The moment that belief cracks, everything becomes more expensive. Every extortion attempt becomes a negotiation. Every kidnapping becomes a risk. Every street-level soldier starts wondering if the families they destroy might one day start hunting them back. That is why Miriam's actions were intolerable. She wasn't just collecting names. She was turning the cartel's impunity into a question mark. And criminals hate question marks, because question marks are how systems collapse. In March 2017, 29 inmates escaped from a prison in Ciudad Victoria by digging a tunnel. To the public, it was shocking. To Miriam, it wasn't just shocking. It was personal. Because among those escapees were people connected to the kidnapping and murder of her daughter. Men she had fought to bring into the light. Men she had forced into cages. Men who now had two new motivations, freedom and rage, and only one place to direct that rage. Her. A prison escape doesn't just release criminals. It releases unfinished revenge. It releases humiliation. It releases cartel logic back into the world, correct the disrespect. Restore control. Erase the example. Miriam requested police protection. Authorities promised patrols. And here's where cartel reality turns even darker. Protection in cartel territory often functions like a placebo. It exists to calm you down. To make you believe you're covered. But it can dissolve at the exact moment you need it, because the cartel doesn't need to remove every patrol. It only needs one gap. One window. One unguarded driveway. One quiet night where no one shows up. And Miriam understood this better than anyone. She wasn't naive about what protection meant. She knew it might fail. But she accepted it anyway, because she was already living in an impossible situation. She had already become the kind of person who woke up expecting to die. And when someone lives that way long enough, fear becomes less like an emotion. And more like a background sound. Like a refrigerator humming. Always there. Unavoidable. So she continued. That's the part most people struggle to understand. Miriam didn't stop hunting because the danger increased. She escalated. Even injured, she escalated. At one point, Miriam broke her foot. She was moving on crutches. The injury should have forced her to slow down, but it did something else. It made her angrier. It made her feel trapped inside her own body, and trapped people become reckless in ways they don't always recognize. Still, Miriam kept pursuing suspects. Kept collecting information. Kept pressing law enforcement. Kept living like the only thing that mattered was consequences. And that obsession, because that's what it becomes at this stage, exposes a final psychological truth about cartel violence. Cartels don't just destroy victims. They reshape them. They turn mothers into hunters. They turn love into mission. They turn grief into something hard and sharp. And then they punish you for what they made you become. Mother's Day arrived. A day that should have been sacred, at least in the emotional sense. In Mexico, Mother's Day carries deep cultural weight. It isn't casual. It's a day of celebration, of family, of gratitude. For Miriam, it was a day that could only feel like cruelty. Because she wasn't celebrating motherhood. She was living in its aftermath, what motherhood looks like after it's been violated by men with guns. And on that day, the cartel chose to act. That timing matters. Cartels understand symbolism. They understand that killing someone on Mother's Day is not just murder. It's psychological warfare. It's cruelty designed to echo. It's the cartel saying, your love means nothing here. We can stain even this day. Miriam was at home. Her body already weakened, still in recovery, still on crutches. Then a vehicle approached. A white Nissan. It pulled up with purpose, not hesitation. There was no negotiation. No warning. No attempt to intimidate. Just gunfire. Fast. Close. Decisive. The kind of shooting that doesn't aim to injure. It aims to erase. Bullets tore into Miriam's body in her own driveway, in the space where a normal family would park a car, carry groceries, greet neighbors. And that's another cartel signature. They love killing you in places that should feel safe, because it corrupts safety itself. It tells the community, if she can die in her driveway, you can die anywhere. Her husband found her. The detail that haunts people who read this case is what she was holding when she died. Her purse. And inside her purse, she carried a pistol. That tells you everything. Not that she expected to shoot her way out. Not that she imagined winning a gunfight. But that she accepted the possibility of death so fully, she took precautions anyway. That is the psychology of a target who never stopped moving. A person who can't afford normal denial. Miriam was killed. Authorities later acted, public outrage spilling into pressure. Some suspects were captured. One was killed in a shootout. But cartels aren't single men. They're organisms. Cut off one limb, another grows. And the deeper consequence was not the arrests. The deeper consequence was the lesson the cartel tried to teach. You cannot win. They killed Miriam to discourage others. But they miscalculated something else. Because when you kill a person like Miriam, you don't just silence her voice. You amplify it. You turn her story into a weapon against you. You turn her into proof that even in a system designed to crush the powerless, someone can still fight back hard enough to scare powerful men. Her death became a mirror held up to the nation. And in that mirror, people saw two realities at once. They saw the cartel's cruelty. And they saw the state's limits. They saw what happens when a mother becomes her own investigator. They saw what happens when that investigator becomes too successful. And then an even darker question emerged, a question that pulls this story into its point of no return. If Miriam Rodriguez, armed with files, disguises, courage, and obsession, could capture 10 criminals and still be murdered, then what does justice even mean in cartel territory? Is justice something you achieve? Or something you briefly touch before it kills you? The cartel wanted her dead to restore fear. But fear isn't the only thing that spreads. Anger spreads too. Grief spreads too. And Miriam's story carried something more contagious than all of it. A template. A method. She had shown families what relentless pursuit could look like. And once families learn the method, the cartel's greatest advantage, silence, starts to weaken. Which means the cartel didn't just kill Miriam. They sparked a wider risk. A country full of grieving people who might decide the law is optional. People who might decide punishment is personal. People who might decide cartel violence deserves cartel responses. And when civilians start thinking that way, the entire structure changes. Because then the cartel isn't just fighting police. It's fighting society. And that's a war no one survives cleanly. Cartels learn fast. They evolve. They adapt. They become careful, not out of morality, but out of survival. That's why they usually avoid certain targets. They don't want attention from governments with real power. They don't want international heat. They don't want consequences that can't be bribed or intimidated. But sometimes cartels don't act like businesses. Sometimes they act like wounded animals. And wounded animals make mistakes. That is what happened when the Guadalajara cartel targeted DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena. To understand why Kiki mattered, you have to understand what cartels fear most. It isn't death. Cartel leaders accept death as an occupational hazard. What they fear is disruption. They fear losing money. They fear losing stability. They fear losing the quiet relationships with politicians and police commanders that keep their operations smooth. And Kiki Camarena was disruption in human form. He wasn't just present. He was effective. He worked investigations that threatened the cartel's core operations. He helped expose infrastructure, networks, and key figures. In a world where corruption protected criminals, Kiki's persistence made him dangerous. Then came Rancho Buffalo. A massive marijuana plantation. Enormous. So large it represented not just a crop but a cartel economy, a machine producing profit on an industrial scale. The Mexican army raided it with intelligence support that involved the DEA. Thousands of tons of marijuana were destroyed, valued in the billions. To a cartel, that is not a raid. That is humiliation. That is financial injury. That is the kind of event that shakes confidence among leadership and attracts attention from rivals. And cartels cannot tolerate humiliation. Humiliation demands correction. So the cartel chose the worst possible correction. They didn't just kill a suspected informant. They didn't just retaliate against a rival group. They targeted a U.S. federal agent. In cartel logic, it likely felt powerful. It likely felt like proving dominance. Like proving that even the United States couldn't operate safely in their territory. But cartel logic has a blind spot. It underestimates political revenge. Because governments don't respond like families. They respond like systems. They respond with pressure and persistence, not emotion. And cartel leaders underestimated how deeply the U.S. would treat Kiki's death as an insult. February 7, 1985. Kiki stepped outside the U.S. consulate in Guadalajara. He expected routine. He expected safety. He did not expect the kind of violence that usually stays hidden. Several vehicles approached him. 4, maybe 5. Men got out. They moved fast, surrounding him, forcing him into a car. In daylight. In public. This wasn't just kidnapping. It was a statement: we can do this wherever we want. But again, statements have consequences. Kiki was taken to a house. A location that later became infamous. Inside that house, he was tortured. Not just beaten. Not just interrogated. Tortured in a way designed to destroy the human mind, pain, fear, helplessness, and time. Torture isn't about information after a certain point. It's about power. And the cartel wanted power. They wanted Kiki's suffering to be part of the payment for the humiliation of Rancho Buffalo. It lasted for days. He was kept alive through unimaginable cruelty. Reports indicate a doctor was involved to prolong his consciousness, reviving him with drugs so he wouldn't pass out, so the torture could continue. That detail isn't just horrifying. It reveals cartel arrogance at its purest form. It's the cartel saying, we control when you faint. We control when you wake. We control how long you suffer. And that arrogance is exactly what caused their fall. Because what they did to Kiki wasn't simply murder. It was a political trigger. When Kiki's body was found, wrapped, buried, his death became impossible to ignore. It wasn't a street crime. It was an international incident. And that's the turning point. Because cartels can survive violence. They can survive local outrage. They can survive even military operations in many cases. But they struggle when the business environment changes, when borders tighten, when politics harden, when corruption becomes too risky to maintain. And Kiki's death changed the environment. The U.S. government responded with pressure that hit Mexico where it hurt, not through speeches, but through logistics and economy. The border was tightened. Trade slowed. It created economic consequences, forcing Mexico to respond more aggressively than it might have otherwise. Then came the larger response, Operation Leyenda. The largest DEA homicide investigation and manhunt. A relentless pursuit of accountability for Kiki Camarina's murder. This wasn't a single raid. It was sustained pressure. And sustained pressure is what cartels fear, because sustained pressure changes behavior inside the system. It makes politicians nervous. It makes police commanders cautious. It makes bribery less effective. It narrows safe spaces. And as the pressure grew, arrests came. Key figures were charged and convicted. The Guadalajara cartel, one of the most powerful criminal organizations, fractured under the weight of attention and consequence. That is what fall looks like in cartel history. Not a single spectacular moment, but a slow collapse of confidence, protection, and cohesion. But here's the darker truth. Even as the cartel fell, the damage remained. Because cartel structures don't disappear. They split. They mutate. They create successors. And many of the organizations that followed, cartels that became even more violent, learned lessons from Kiki's murder. Not the lesson the public wanted them to learn. Not don't kill. But don't create heat you can't manage. So cartel violence became more strategic after Kiki. More careful. More selective. More hidden. And that's why Kiki's story still matters today. Because it shows how cartel power operates at its peak, bold enough to kidnap a U.S. agent in daylight. And it shows how cartel power can still fall, not because it runs out of guns, but because it makes the wrong enemy. An enemy that can't be bribed. An enemy that can't be threatened. An enemy with the ability to reshape the environment around the cartel until survival becomes impossible. Kiki wasn't just a man. To cartel leaders, he became a symbol too. A symbol of unacceptable disruption. So they killed him. And in doing so, they created a different symbol, one that triggered consequences beyond their imagination. This is what cartels often forget. They can choose violence. They cannot always choose the response. Cartel violence ends lives. But it also reshapes the living. That's what people misunderstand when they search for closure in stories like these. There is rarely closure. There is only after. After the gunshots. After the funerals. After the press conferences. After the last body is counted and the cameras leave. Because cartels don't just kill people. They alter communities. They change the meaning of trust. They change the meaning of silence. They change how a child grows up, how a parent sleeps, how neighbors greet each other in the street. The echo is everywhere. It's in the way people stop looking strangers in the eyes. It's in the way families don't report crimes. It's in the way a city learns to ignore screams because it's safer not to hear them. And the echo doesn't care if the cartel leader was arrested, killed, or replaced. Because the psychology remains. That's why these stories of wrong persons matter so deeply. Not because they're inspiring in a clean way. Not because they're heroic. But because they expose the hidden tension at the center of cartel power. Cartels want to convince everyone that fear is permanent. These people proved fear can be challenged. But they also prove challenging fear comes with a cost that rarely feels worth it in the moment. Look at Don Alejo. He didn't start as an activist. He didn't start as a symbol. He was a ranch owner who believed land isn't just property, land is a life. When Los Zetas gave him an ultimatum, they expected him to behave like everyone else. To vacate. To submit. To choose survival at the price of surrender. Instead, he sent his workers away and prepared his home like a fortress. He knew he would probably die. But he refused to live without dignity. Cartels hate dignity more than guns. Because dignity is contagious. It's the spark that can start a town talking. And towns talking can become towns resisting. His last stand didn't defeat Los Zetas. But it did something cartels fear more. It created a legend. And legends become weapons in the minds of people who are exhausted from fear. Then look at Hipólito Mora. Mora built resistance in a region that desperately needed it. But the longer the resistance lasted, the more it attracted opportunists. And the resistance began to fracture. Rivals emerged. Self-defense groups became violent factions. Some members drifted toward cartel behavior. And Mora's story reveals a truth that isn't comfortable. Sometimes fighting cartels creates the conditions for new cartels to rise. Because once you normalize armed power in a community, it doesn't always go back into the box. That is the echo. It's how violence becomes governance. It's how justice becomes flexible. It's how survival becomes a business model. Then there's Miriam Rodriguez. Her story is one of the most psychologically disturbing echoes because it shows what cartel violence can do to a mother. It turned her into a hunter. It forced her to become her own investigator. She proved civilians could achieve what institutions failed to do. And for that, she was killed. But again, the cartel's attempt to erase her created something else. A template. Families learned what relentless pursuit looked like. They learned that files, names, pressure, and exposure could force consequences. And some families, in their own grief, may decide to copy that template. Which creates another echo, vigilantism. When institutions fail repeatedly, people stop believing in them. And when people stop believing in institutions, they start inventing justice. Invented justice is rarely clean. It can be righteous for one family and catastrophic for another. It can be necessary and dangerous at the same time. And cartels exploit that chaos. Because chaotic communities are easier to control. Then there's Kiki Camarena. His death triggered an international response and helped fracture a cartel, proving that cartel violence can provoke consequences too large to contain. But the echo of Kiki's case wasn't just justice. It was evolution. Cartels learned lessons. They didn't become kinder. They became smarter. They learned what kind of heat to avoid. They learned what targets create political earthquakes. They learned to hide brutality better, or outsource it. They learned to corrupt systems more deeply, so consequences became harder to deliver. So what do these echoes add up to? They add up to a reality the public hates hearing. Cartel stories don't end when someone dies. They continue through behavior. They continue through fear. They continue through silence. They continue through the normalization of violence. And the normalization is the most dangerous part. Because once a community adapts to cartel power, it begins to build around it like a city built around toxic water. People still work. People still marry. People still celebrate birthdays. But everything happens under a shadow. And the shadow teaches you the rules. Don't talk too much. Don't ask too many questions. Don't take photos. Don't look into the wrong car window at the wrong time. Don't say the wrong name. Don't trust the wrong person. And the most poisonous rule of all: if you can ignore it, ignore it. Because attention is dangerous. That's how cartels win long-term. Not through constant shootings, but through the psychological colonization of daily life. But here's the contradiction. Every so often, a wrong person appears. A person who refuses to live under those rules. And the cartel can kill them, but killing them creates risk. Because the wrong person does not disappear cleanly. They leave behind a story. And stories travel faster than fear. A father tells his son about the old ranch owner who didn't surrender. A mother tells her daughter about the woman who hunted her child's killers. A police officer tells a rookie about the agent whose death brought down powerful men. And those stories do something subtle and dangerous. They remind people that cartel power is not fate. It is an agreement enforced by violence. And agreements can be broken. But breaking them changes you. This is the part no one likes to admit. Resistance can be beautiful. It can also be tragic. It can create freedom. It can also create chaos. And cartels depend on the world seeing that chaos and deciding fear is easier. So the ending of these stories cannot be comforting. Because cartel reality doesn't offer comfort. It offers trade-offs. Stay silent and survive. Speak out and become a target. Fight back and risk becoming what you hate. Run away and live with the shame of surrender. There is no clean exit. Only choices. And the most disturbing realization of all is this. Cartels don't only rely on criminals. They rely on ordinary people making ordinary decisions under extraordinary pressure. Every day. In thousands of moments no camera ever records. The clerk who doesn't report extortion. The neighbor who pretends not to hear gunshots. The official who delays a patrol. The journalist who kills a story. The family who moves away quietly. Those decisions are understandable. They're human. But they become the foundation of cartel power. And then, once in a generation, someone refuses to make those decisions. Someone like Don Alejo. Someone like Mora. Someone like Miriam. Someone like Kiki. And cartels discover something terrifying. Not everyone will cooperate with fear. Not everyone can be bribed. Not everyone can be scared into obedience. And that is why cartels sometimes overreact. Because the wrong person reminds them that their power is fragile. It is not divine. It is not permanent. It is maintained. It is managed. It is enforced. And that means it can be lost. So the final echo isn't heroism. It isn't closure. It's a lingering question that follows you long after the narration ends. If cartel power depends on silence, how long can silence survive, before too many wrong persons decide they'd rather die fighting than live obeying? Because once enough people decide that, the cartel doesn't just face resistance. It faces extinction. And the cartel knows it. That's why they punish examples. That's why they erase symbols. That's why they try to make fear feel eternal. But eternity is a human illusion. And fear, like any illusion, breaks. Which person was the cartel's worst mistake, and why? Do you believe fighting back makes things better, or just brings more violence?